Hello and welcome to another edition of the Front Page. My name is Andrew McKeever, the managing editor of the Manchester Journal, and I'll be your host today. And today it's my pleasure to have with us down here at the studios of GNAT-TV, Senator Randy Brock from Franklin County and Grand Isle County, who's a Republican candidate for governor this year. Senator Brock, welcome to GNAT.
Well, thank you for having me.
Great to have you here, and thank you for making the time to be with us today and talk a little bit about some of the issues that will be coming up this year in the gubernatorial campaign. Before we get started, Senator Brock was the auditor of Vermont from 2005 to 2007 and has been the state senator from Franklin County and Grand Isle, as I said a moment ago, since 2008. Before that, he was a decorated Vietnam veteran and has also been a financial services executive, now retired, has served on many boards and been a small business owner and a politician as well. Well, it sounds like you've been around the block then, Mr.
I've done a couple of things.
All right. Well, first of all, the obvious question, what prompted you to run? You could have stayed on at the state senate and probably enjoyed several more terms up there. What prompted you to throw your hat into the gubernatorial ring?
Well, frankly, it may sound corny, but the reason is because I love Vermont. I love our state. I love the things that we are and the things that we can be, and I'm very concerned that the direction we're moving in is a direction that's not a good one for Vermont and its future, and I hope that the background, the experience, the things that I've done can help put Vermont on a path that would make this a better place for ourselves, for our children, and for our grandchildren.
Okay. Well, as you are well aware, having been in the Senate for the past 4 years, there's a lot of issues the state is confronting, many of them economic, but let's go down through a list of a few of them, that, or at least some of the big issues that come to mind. And I guess first and foremost, since your colleagues up in the state Senate recently passed a bill on this, let's talk about the whole health care or health reform issue. The Senate and the legislature recently passed a rather sweeping bill on that subject, and I guess what is your take on the bill? Were you in favor of it or opposed to it or have concerns about it? Where do you sit on that?
Well, what we did in this past session is we passed a bill, H 559, which implemented the health care exchanges that are required under the Federal Affordable Care Act. But this was a follow-on to what we did last year, in which we passed a bill that sets the stage. It's the precursor for a single-payer health care system.
That would be Act 48?
Correct. And I have concerns about both of those bills. I think there was one senator who was on the majority side of H 559 who put it best. And I think she said it's sort of like driving into a fog of pea soup. And I don't know where I'm going with this, but I trust that we're going to get to the right direction. Well, when we are talking about the health care of every Vermonter, we're talking about a sixth of our economy. I don't think we should be doing something such as driving into a fog based on trust.
Should we be doing anything at all, or do you feel like the present system is sustainable in some way? I mean, what I've heard is that we're spending, close to $5 billion a year now on health care. Within another 10 years, that could be double. I mean, is that reasonable to think we could just sort of stand pat? And
there's a phrase that I remember from being a kid: when in danger or in doubt, run in circles, scream and shout. Because we have a problem, it doesn't mean that we need to solve it by taking over a sixth of our economy and having 5 unelected, unaccountable individuals be placed in charge of all of our healthcare and all of our healthcare decisions. It's very clear that our current system is broken and it needs to be fixed. What we're doing right now is clearly unsustainable, but that doesn't mean that single-payer, government-run healthcare insurance is the only answer.
Okay.
Now, we're told, frankly, very, very often that healthcare costs are out of control. But think about healthcare, and healthcare to a great extent is a technology issue, a technology problem. Every time I walk into a store that sells large screen TVs, I notice that the price is lower than it was the week before. When I look at airline travel, I know that airline travel to a lot of jurisdictions, a lot of destinations, is less in inflation-adjusted dollars than it was before deregulation in 1979. The free market does work in price control, but is healthcare different? Well, healthcare is not the free market. What's the difference? Because government has been helping. They've been helping for 50 years, and each time the government helps, the costs seem to go up. Now, in those parts of healthcare that have not been controlled in that way, we've seen prices decline as well. Think like LASIK eye surgery is a prime example of that. Prices have declined. So you ask yourself, why is healthcare costs so high? Well, part of the problem is us. We have a situation in which the buyer of services doesn't know what the cost is, and as a result has no incentive to save money. The seller, typically, you ask your doctor what a procedure costs, they can't tell you. They don't know what the cost is, and again, have no incentive to save money. Market forces aren't working properly. We also have lots of ways in which we can potentially save money in healthcare, but we're not applying those. We're focused right now in Vermont on instituting a single-payer healthcare system and not focused on things that can be proven to in fact save money and deal with some of the high healthcare costs.
Well, isn't healthcare, though, somewhat different from, let's say, buying a car or a refrigerator? I mean, there you can shop around. I mean, healthcare, it's your life. It's your quality of life. It's your wellness.
Sure it is. And when you have an emergency, when you have a broken leg, when you have to go to the hospital, there's no question. You're not going to shop around for those services. But so often, there are services that are purchased through part of healthcare in which price transparency is important. Price transparency is important even in those situations in which you go in to have something done on an urgent care basis, but you don't have your car fixed without knowing how much you're going to pay for that car. You know how much the hourly rate is for the mechanic who's going to work on your car. But when you go to the hospital, when you go to your doctor's office, you don't have a clue what the price is for anything that you're going to buy. Right. And as a result, there's no incentive to compare prices. Wouldn't it be great to be able to go on a website and know if you have an appendectomy in Bennington, how is it going to compare to if you have that procedure done in, let's say, Rutland?
Mm-hmm. Well, now that, I gather, is probably one of your concerns about the nature of this proposed exchange or health exchange that the state is setting up, since as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, that will be one state-run exchange. There won't be
There'll be one state-run exchange. And let me add that what I've just said about price transparency, that's not the only way to control healthcare costs. Right. There are lots of things we can do, such as encouraging wellness, such as providing incentives for healthy behaviors, such as dealing with tort reform and ensuring that evidence-based medicine is being employed as opposed to doing tests solely for the basis of defensive medicine. I mean, we can go down a whole list of things that can be tested and that can be evidence-based, and that also, unlike single-payer healthcare, can be reversible. So if we pilot things, if we do things that don't work, we're not stuck with taking over a sixth of our economy and being on an absolutely irreversible course.
So if you're elected governor in November, what would be your approach then to changing the course of the state's healthcare direction?
Well, one of the things that I would do is, on a fast-track basis, is do the kind of study that's not been done before, and that is to focus on the things that can control costs, to measure them, to design programs that will in fact do that, and then to set off, just as based on my experience as state auditor, to measure what we do and see what works and confirm the fact that the measures that are taking are in fact working to bend the cost curve. That's the first thing. The second thing that I would do is focus on choice and competition, something that we haven't attempted and that none of the studies that the Shumlin administration or its the legislative actions under Shumlin when he was pro tem did not do, and that is focus on how can we increase choice and competition? How can we look at all the insurers that we've chased away over the years and attract other insurers to come into Vermont so that employers and individuals can have a broader range of choice than they do right now? That's what I would do as governor.
Okay. Well, and as you said a moment ago, the healthcare situation, the healthcare industry in Vermont is a huge part of the state's economy, and which leads me into the next sort of almost standby obligatory question that I've asked many politicians over the years, which is, what is your sense of the state's economy now, and what are our weaknesses? And as governor, what would be your first or your highest priorities in terms of fixing what you see as being problematic within the state's economy?
Well, we have an unemployment rate right now that's 4.8%. It's substantially better than the national average, and that's very, very encouraging. At the same time, I think everybody in Vermont knows somebody who's unemployed and who also knows somebody who's left Vermont for greener pastures. And so as I look at that number, I am concerned as to whether or not it's truly measuring people who would love to work in Vermont but who can't work in Vermont. So that's problem one. The second problem that I see is I see people out of work on the one hand, but I see businesses in Vermont who are constantly saying, I can't get people with the skills that I need to do the jobs that I have. I also see every time I look at a publication that rates states on their business friendliness and their attractiveness to growth and expansion for additions to a state's economy, I see Vermont near the bottom. Forbes magazine, 47th in the nation. And the reasons for that, among others, are high taxation and a Byzantine, at times, regulatory environment. And you have to recognize, when you start talking about business growth, government doesn't create jobs, except for government jobs.
Right, right.
Businesses, entrepreneurs create jobs. And in my mind, the job of government is to make sure that we have a fertile environment in which businesses can grow and can prosper, and that we have an attitude in state government that welcomes business and doesn't treat it as an enemy.
Do you feel that's the case now?
All too often, the stories that I hear from businesses, I had a guy come to me and say, gee, I finally got my permits. It only took me 2 years. Well, there's something wrong about that. And make no mistake about this. I believe that we need to preserve all of the environmental protections that we have. The environment that we have here is among our greatest assets. That's what makes Vermont so attractive for those of us who live here and for people who are considering coming here. So I'm not suggesting at all that we relax those requirements. But boy, we ought to make it fast, easy, transparent, clear, with unambiguous regulations that are easy to follow, and with a staff of folks at our various state agencies who view themselves not as people there to make sure you do everything you're supposed to, but people whose job it is to help you through the process and to help you succeed because they want you and they want your business. We talk about tone at the top so often from our leaders, but it's not just tone at the top. It's tone at the middle. It's the people you deal with over the counter. And I think one of the first tasks that I have as government is to set that tone and to begin instilling it at every level of government so that our state employees, who, by the way, I think do a great job, can do an even better job of promoting Vermont as a place that welcomes business and that wants to see businesses succeed.
Let me ask you a question I think probably every politician hates to answer, and that is, what taxes would you raise or change to balance the budget, pay for costs coming out of Tropical Storm Irene, or other services that you may feel the government needs to do?
I think the first step is we need to extract every dollar of value out of the taxes we already collect. Right now, I'm very concerned that we don't have an effective measure, a mechanism of performance evaluation of government programs to ensure that they're doing what's intended and that they're doing it as economically as they should be. I would take a look at the size and scope of state government. I think our employees do a great job, as I've mentioned. I just think there are too many of them. Now, that being said, do I want to lay off tons of state employees? And the answer is absolutely not. I don't. And that's why this time, right now, is one that I am particularly interested in running for governor, because 25% of our state employees are scheduled to retire within the next 5 years. What better time is there to reorganize government, to make it more efficient, to use process improvement, technology, and other kinds of ways to break down some of the barriers, the duplication that we see in state government, to ensure that our performance is as optimum as it can be so that those tax dollars we're using, we get more value out of them. I've done that in the private sector. That's one of the things I'm most proud of that I did at the large company that I worked at. And you can do it with state government right now without having the mass layoffs, because we don't want to add to unemployment and we don't want to break the covenant we had with people who've worked so hard for so many years.
Related subject to that, of course, and again, another hardy perennial in Vermont politics is education spending.
Yes.
We spend an awful lot of money on education in the state, and a lot of it oftentimes seems to me to be very inefficiently allocated. Act 60, Act 68, our financing system is always sort of a poster child for, at least complexity, if nothing else.
We do, yeah. Any tax system that has to use the coefficient of dispersion as part of the tax calculation is obviously complex, and that we do. And it's interesting, if you look to 2000 to 2010, the per pupil spending, the cost per pupil in Vermont for spending went up 149.9% to an average of $17,000 per kid, while the enrollment went down 18.3%. Now, just for fun, I took just a curve, where you take the spending and you keep it going up at that rate, and you take the enrollment and you keep it going down at that rate, and you carry it out over the years. What I wanted to see was how much would it cost to educate a kid in Vermont when there were no students in school at all. And you don't want to know what that number is.
A shockingly high one, I'm sure.
It's clear that it's unsustainable. We can't continue to do that.
So what are we going to do differently then?
As we look at the spending, let's take the spending number as a start. I served on the Senate Education Committee 2 years ago, and while there, I asked for a list of the 15 highest spending districts in the state and the 15 lowest spending districts of the state. At that time, it was a high of about $18,000 per kid and a low of about $7,700 per kid. And then I said, let's take the test scores, the standardized test scores of the kids in those schools, and then lay them out. And you know what was interesting?
I'm going to assume that the answer is that the ones at the lower end had the higher scores.
There was no difference.
Oh,
there was statistically, there was no difference between the two. We then had a study done by a consulting firm this past summer looking at Act 60 as to whether or not there was fairness in terms of the distribution of education funding statewide, which is what the courts required us to do. And that study also indicated that there was no real correlation between the amount being spent per pupil and the results actually achieved. There were a bunch of other factors that made a big difference, such as the quality of teaching, the nature of the curriculum, and so on. But the amount of spending was not part of that equation. And what that tells me in a nutshell is we have a lot of inefficient use of money. And that's where I think our focus should be, is on the inefficient use of money in schools and clearly on the issue of staffing. Now, from staffing, we have the same kind of issue in our schools that we have in our state employees. We have an aging demographic, which gives us, again, a tremendous opportunity to do things differently. I think we start by looking at the 62 supervisory unions that we have in Vermont. That's a large number, huge administrative overhead over a relatively small number of students. And there, I think we can achieve some significant savings by reducing the number of supervisory unions and get more value for what we spend. The second thing I would look at is the student-teacher ratio. Right now, Vermont has a student-teacher ratio of about 9.8 to 1, the lowest in the nation. The average in America right now is a little over 15 to 1. And I certainly wouldn't advocate going up to huge numbers of kids per class, but a modest improvement in many schools, or a modest increase in some schools from the 9.8 to 1 to somewhere around 10, 11, or 12 to 1, that could save $130 to $135 million a year alone. Reducing our supervisory unions from 62 to 16, by my calculation, could save somewhere around $30 million a year. And that's not small change. And I think those kinds of things are ways we can do it, provided we add to it some of the things that we've learned in studies that we've been doing over the past 30 years about how to improve the quality of education. I think the move to getting a Secretary of Education reporting to the governor, whether it's a Democrat governor or a Republican governor, I think is a step in the right direction by empowering the Department of Education more than it is right now, but at the same time still maintaining enough local control so that people in localities do have control over what they do.
Well, that's always been the rub with trying to get that student-teacher ratio up a little bit higher, because to me that implies closing schools. I mean, how else do we get to that point?
There may be.
And there are a lot of localities, as I'm sure you're well aware.
That's a third rail. I mean, I know on the Education Committee 2 years ago, we did something unusual for Montpelier. We actually went out and listened to people. And we held hearings throughout the state, 6 or 7 different hearings to hear from people. We heard from more than 600 people. And local control was something that we heard a lot of when we probed as to what is local control. You know, there are lots of areas where there hasn't been local control in 25 years. But notwithstanding that, people do want to have control over what goes on in the schools and have a say. And I think we can achieve that. The other thing, though, that we heard was that as parents, we want parent-centered decision-making about our schools, because we know what's good for our kids. The school board doesn't know, the Department of Education doesn't know, the school counselor doesn't know, we as parents know. And parents were telling us, look, I have 3 kids. I have 1 kid in private school, I have 1 kid in public school, I have 1 kid in special education, all in different places, because those are the things that are right for my child. And I want the ability to decide that. And I believe that parent-centered education makes a great deal of sense.
Let me shift over to the energy sector for a second. We've had a number of, well, again, another hardy perennial in Vermont politics, right? This year we had a very big decision on Vermont Yankee.
Yeah.
Assuming, and this is of course a big assumption, that the Public Service Board decides to allow Vermont Yankee to continue to operate. I mean, is that something you're going to be in favor of, or do you feel like, hey, too many question marks with Energy Corporation, we kind of need to begin to phase out of that? And if that's the case, then what do we do to replace that?
Well, the one thing to bear in mind right now is that we don't get any power from Vermont Yankee because the decisions we're in right now, our power is coming from a variety of other sources, almost all of them, by the way, clean energy sources.
Hydro-Quebec.
Now, that being said, when the decision was made to vote last year, I didn't want to vote on this because I thought it was premature. We hadn't had the NRC's report that now says that Vermont Yankee is safe. We hadn't had the results of the Attorney General's investigation on the leak. We hadn't even had our own consultant's complete report in at that time, and yet we voted. Now, before that vote, I proposed in an amendment on the floor that we explore a new state-of-the-art nuclear plant of the same kind that President Obama has been advocating, same types that are in use widely in France, that we explore doing that as a potential replacement for Vermont Yankee on the site. That didn't have any traction and was defeated. So when it came to the vote, I was torn because I'm not opposed to nuclear power per se. But on that particular case, I said to myself two things. One, about Entergy as a company. Would I enter into a 20-year contract with someone I didn't trust? And I said no. The second is that Entergy told us at that time that it was non-negotiable. They were going to spin off this plant as well as their other elderly plants into a subsidiary. And they were going to take $3.5 billion out of those combined companies and put it in the pockets of Entergy shareholders, leaving us with a debt-ridden plant that would then have to go to Wall Street, borrow another $1.5 billion to stay in operation. I couldn't vote for that either, so I voted against it, even though I wanted all things being equal. Now, that being said, the Annexus deal, the spinoff, is now dead. New York State declined to allow that to happen. We still have Entergy. And the question is, if we can provide proper oversight of Entergy, if we can keep it on a short leash, and now with the assurance that we have from the NRC, I might revisit that position. I'd love to have alternatives, but the alternative that we see right now, to me, makes not a lot of sense that we say a plant that we have oversight of, we're going to allow it to stay in operation based on what the NRC says and sell power to Connecticut and Massachusetts while we buy nuclear power from Seabrook and New Hampshire. That's a perverse situation. We
could talk about this subject for a very long time, but there are a few more things I would want to cover before we run out of time. One of them being related to the energy situation, I think. Governor Shumlin has been very keen, as far as I can tell, from where we sit down here, to advocate for clean energy credits, tax credits, and support of solar, wind, and other alternative energy sources. As governor, if you're elected, would you be a fan of those sorts of things too, or do you have concerns or questions about that?
I favor renewable energy. I think that renewable energy is a great concept, a wonderful idea. I would like, though, it to be developed with private venture capital rather than with taxpayer and ratepayer money. What Governor Shumlin proposed this year was a renewable portfolio standard layered on top of things like the SPEED program and the standard offer. And if you think education funding is complex, you should read how this stuff actually was designed to operate. But when you clear all the smoke away, what the renewable portfolio standard meant was that we would be at 75% renewable energy within 20 years and 90% by 2050. But at a cost of $300 to $450 million to ratepayers in higher electric bills. Now, that being said, all of this was done ostensibly to reduce our carbon footprint, to save the planet. But again, when you start looking at digging in the numbers, which I have a tendency to do, unfortunately, what I found was, by the Public Service Department's own statistics, this would reduce our carbon footprint by less than 3% in 20 years. That, to me, was not a good trade-off, because when you start looking at things like that, it becomes a Robin Hood in reverse, in that it's the poor and working Vermonter who pays the same amount per kilowatt hour as the wealthy, who has to pay the bill for these renewables, which in some cases are 4, 5, and 6 times the cost of the market rate for electricity that we get right now. And who gets the benefit from that? Well, if you look at wind turbines that are in people's backyards. They're in the backyards of typically rather affluent families who, along with the renewable energy providers, the companies that sell these systems, are the ones who can benefit from the tax credits and subsidies that they get as a result. So we have the poor subsidizing the rich, which I don't think makes a whole lot of sense.
One final question then, and sort of related to that, you and your legislative colleagues spent a fair amount of time this session debating this merger between Central Vermont Public Service and Green Mountain Power. And this flashpoint of the $21 million seemed to preoccupy a lot of everyone's attention. What was your take on that whole situation? Was the deal that was fashioned where Green Mountain Power, as I understand it, and you were more well versed in this than I am probably, offering $45 million worth of weatherization and efficiency improvements? So was that a fair trade-off to that $21 million that ratepayers in, I think it was 2002, fronted to CVPS to help them grow?
Well, what happened in a nutshell was that there was a decision in 2001 that came about when Central Vermont Public Service was facing bankruptcy. Public Service Board allowed them to increase rates to ratepayers. The ratepayers, though, a promise was made in that order that in the event of a windfall profit, such as the sale of the company, that money would be paid back in some manner. It was left to the Public Service Board to determine precisely how. Fast forward to today. The utilities, along with the Shumlin administration's Public Service Department, excuse me, agreed to allow the ratepayers to be paid back through, excuse me, recovering from bronchitis, allowed them to be paid back through thermal efficiencies and a variety of efficiency projects.
So that would not have been a fair trade-off? I mean, one could argue that...
Well, you can consider what happens, though. Those efficiencies would be then added to the rate base. And instead of paying back the ratepayers who paid the money in, they would go to efficiencies and other things that would form some sort of, quote, societal benefit. How you'd measure that, I'm not sure. Then the efficiency investments would be added to the rate base, and the ratepayers would be billed for it again.
That was the shell game part of it that seemed to get, I think a lot of folks have said, more than the question of like whether or not we're going to get $76 back in either
and whether it's $76 or whatever it is. The point is, it's the ratepayers' money. And I got a letter from an elderly woman. She's 78 years old. Her husband is 80. And she said, you know, when they asked us to pay in this money, we did it, and we did it for years. And we've lived in our house since then, and we've weatherized it as best we could. We've put in the efficiencies we need. We've, sealed our windows and so on. And now, when they've got the money back, they won't give it to us. They're going to invest it in thermal efficiency and other kinds of things, and we'll never see the results of it, and that's not fair. And she's right. It's not fair.
Well, I guess then that's to be continued, since that case is now before the Public Service Board, and the whole issue of it being an open docket
Well, here's one thing. We did in the Senate. We passed in the Senate overwhelmingly an amendment to a bill that essentially said in such a case where there's a windfall profit, that the results of that profit should be distributed back either in cash or in credits, such as credits on a bill, back to the ratepayers in the territory in which those expenditures were made. Unfortunately, it didn't survive the conference committee with the House. Now, some argued that, well, you're interfering in an open docket of a quasi-judicial board, the Public Service Board. Well, wait a minute. It's not the judiciary. It's not the courts, which is a separate branch. The Public Service Board is a creature of the legislature. The legislature makes policy that the Public Service Board follows. And to say that the legislature has to wait until every docket is closed before it changes a policy is absurd.
Yeah, well, I know there have been at least a couple of instances where that was not apparently a major stumbling block in the past. But
well, that's right. I mean, I don't like potentially interfering in open dockets either, but this was such an egregious case, and it was so wrong and so arrogant for government and the utilities to think that it could take the ratepayers' money and then use it as it saw fit for its own pet programs, for programs that weren't funded in the general fund and now are being funded by the money that the ratepayers paid years ago in order to keep that company from going broke. That was not right.
Well, Senator Brock, again, thank you very much for being with us today. A real pleasure to talk with you, and good luck down the road as you go forward in your campaign. And perhaps we'll have a chance to talk again back here when a few months go by.
Great. Well, thanks so much.
All right. Thank you, sir, and good luck. And thank all of you for watching today. This has been The Front Page on GNAT-TV. My name's Andrew McKeever, Managing Editor of the Manchester Journal. Pleasure having you with us today, and we'll see you the next time.